G'day, it's Milton Kane from the Christian Democratic Party. Today I want to discuss the subject of free trade agreements. The question is about how good are free trade agreements. We need to ask ourselves the question of what they do. A free trade agreement is where one country says to another country, we are not going to put a barrier of entry. We're not going to charge an import tax upon things that you sell to us, or certain things that you sell to us, and we won't put, and you won't put any on some of the products that you will import into your country. Now, this is how the whole thing about free trade agreements work, and the reason behind that very often is in economics term what's called comparative advantage. One of the problems with that particular comparison is when you look at comparative advantage, one assumes that the people who were employed in a particular industry and suddenly they are not, that they can transition to another industry immediately. Some of the things which are important for us to recall. I'm from Newcastle, so I'll talk about BHP steel production in Newcastle. When BHP steel production closed down in Newcastle, there was great fanfare about how that 85% of the people were retrained. There was 15% that were not. But not only that, not only was 15% not only retrained, many of those that retrained did not get jobs anyway. So the transition into other employment was not as straightforward as perhaps the people thought it was going to be. Anybody would have known that was highly possible. Not all skills are fully transferable. We've had decisions in the past where politicians have made decisions indicating how great it is to go to one plan or another. One of those was when, some years ago, the Prime Minister Bob Hawke talked about the clever country. And of course that was followed on by Julia Gillard, who wanted everybody to go to university. Okay, not everybody is capable of going to university, nor have the desire to go to university. Not all people are capable of doing all things. That's why we have so many different people doing so many different things. And some are experts in some fields and some are basically a square peg in a round hole and they don't really fit too well and they tumble from one job to another. You see, one of the difficulties is when an economics theory person sits down and he talks about how it is better to produce something in this place other than that place, he does not always consider the costs. And let's have a look at some of those. Let's assume that we've entered into a new free trade agreement deal, and as a net result of that, 100,000 people lose their jobs. Of that 100,000, let's assume that 90,000 of those will actually find alternative employment. Okay, so that means a residual 10,000 people who will not be able to find employment one way or the other. So these people will be put onto unemployment benefits. Essentially, the amount of money that a person on unemployment benefits can get, the maximum amount of money I understand, is about $15,700 a year. Which means that the cost to the taxpayer for 10,000 people to be on unemployment benefits is $157 million a year. Now that is a significant cost for this new trade deal, but that is not often considered. But you see, you actually have a look at it, it's even cost more than that, because prior to that, these 10,000 people were contributors to the tax system, because they earn money and they pay taxes. So what it does effectively, it costs the general public a lot more money. We may not pay it when we buy the product, but we pay it during the course of the year through the various tax revenue that we have to pay to cover these things. One of the things that we need to always consider when we look at that, is it really a true mix of change from one thing to another? Let's have a look at a few examples of where what we have seen is where we've moved manufacturing offshore, for example. Kmart purchased a lot of their products from Bangladesh, and they are produced by people who, as we saw some years ago in the news, were actually locked into buildings to sow their products, and they had to sow at a certain rate to get any decent money. And the money that they were getting, which they called to be decent, was only a subsistence living. They worked 12 hours a day. And what was the benefit for them? Not much at all, because all they were able to do was to live to work. Now, this particular business was not owned by the people of Bangladesh. It was owned by a multinational that was getting their best they could from these people. These people were essentially working as, I suppose, semi-slaves. They were being paid something, but they were still treated very poorly. Now, this goes across the board on many things, where people are living in a subsistence lifestyle, while people in other parts of the world are actually reaping the benefits from it. We know that many multinational companies will actually choose to select another country to actually manufacture their product. They like the free trade agreement because they can get the product into wherever they want to get it at the cheapest possible price. But the multinational will still be taking the cream off the top. And the less the barrier to come in, the more cream that they can collect. You see, some people will say, well, at least it gives these people a job. Well, maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. But the sort of job they get, do we support the slavery component of their job? Do we support that? I would hope not. In the New South Wales Parliament, there was a bill approved recently about stamping up modern slavery. It was against the modern slavery bill, and it was also a similar bill was put through the federal parliament. And yet this did not tackle this very situation where we in the West enable people to, enslave people to produce the things that we want to consume, and those people get very little reward for their work. That is, by definition, slavery. See, we need to do things a lot better. Now, when we come back to the effect on the Australian, for example, under the free trade agreement, people can bring in whatever they want, and so that means a lot of our farmers are finding that their products are being challenged by products coming in from overseas. Now, the standards that people have in different places are different to ours. As you know, we're not allowed to have freedom of taking fruit right throughout the country, and even some other products, for example, honey and things like that. We can't take them around the country because we actually have protection areas, because we don't want to see disease going all over the place. When we start importing products from other places, we have the high potential of bringing in pests into this country that we don't currently have. And so hence it's appropriate to do something about that. But even putting that aside, let's assume that we decide that it is far better to have a particular product produced in another country. The people employed in doing that in this country, the people who own the businesses that do that in this country, they are now no longer able to compete. But can they always transition to something else? That's the big question. And what is the cost associated with that, and who's going to pay for it? You see, The problem with these free trade agreements, they say, oh, it just is all about a free market. Well, how free is it? Let's have a look at the circumstances of wages in this country. In Australia, when you do your work, you are paid a wage. You also have, in association with that wage, certain entitlements as well. And those entitlements vary from one country to another. In Australia, a part of the wages that you earn go towards taxation, and that taxation supplies a social wage for those people who are unemployed, those people who are retired, and so on and so forth. There's also the healthcare and all those other things which are paid for from that particular wage. Now, when you compare that to other parts of the world where there is no social wage, there is no social component, there is nothing else like that, sure, their wages are less. There may be less. They are contributing less to the society, and that community does not care for its people in the manner that we do. We choose to care for our people by supplying a safety net for so many things. Some people say the safety net is not big enough yet, and it probably isn't, but we're not going in that debate at the moment. The issue is that we, within our wage, we supply the resources to government for a safety net for the people. Now, the other countries do not. So we are not comparing like with like. The other thing too is that we have found over the years, when things are produced in a different country, their standards are very different. And sometimes their safety and other standards do not come to our standard. One of the things is in the automotive trade, to be able to accept some of the vehicles coming in from other parts of the world, they've actually had to change the codes, so that the safety standard is not at the same level that it used to be when it was predominantly Australian vehicles. That was a part of a deal done under the whole, because they are the parts of the whole thing. And of course, the other side of it is we become vulnerable. We do become vulnerable to other countries. For example, we have a look at this where we've got these free trade deals with China, and we've been relying upon China for so much imports over the last several years. As we note, in the last week and a half to 2 weeks, what we've seen is China suddenly deciding what they're going to do is to impose a tariff on certain products from Australia, and also simply say that beef from certain abattoirs they will not accept. You see, one of the problems is that these agreements, they're sort of, well, I guess, sort of gentleman agreements. We can't enforce them. They're not enforceable. But we are relying upon them. And the people in Australia are relying upon things that they need. And we can no longer produce them here because it takes too long to tool up. Congratulations to those people who were able to tool up for respirators for the COVID-19. That was a wonderful thing of a quick response to a need that we had when we could no longer import them. So having these free trade deals can be helpful, providing that there's a lot of other things considered. But may I suggest to you that we are far better, instead of rushing around with free trade deals, we need to make sure that when we are allowing another person in another country to produce something for us, that they are getting a fair wage and that they're not being ripped off by a multinational. The reason why we see so many car manufacturing plants in various places like the Philippines and other places like that is not because of their unique ability to be able to develop these cars, but it's rather because the multinational companies can use the labour there in their automated factories to be able to actually get the car together without paying so much for wages. And of course, in those countries, they don't have very strong wage protection bills. You see, on one hand, if we want to support free trade, we can't have wages support in this country. If we want wages support and we want to have a free trade deal, we need to make sure that we are trading like with like. The comparative advantage falls over all the time when clearly examined. When you have a look at the full facts, not just some of them, we are far better off to let Australians produce what they can and do what we can and import the things that we need beyond what we can produce. We're far better off like that. We are far better off to help other countries to establish their own independence, their own manufacturing independence, and not plant a multinational company there to dominate, control and manage their people by giving them a poor wage to keep them poor. If we really believe that all people are equal, and we ought to make sure that all people that we can are treated well, are paid a good wage for their services, and that wage is more than sufficient for them to be able to just survive. It must be far more. Free trade deals do not deliver that. They do not deliver that. One of the free trade deals we had was with, we were going to Thailand. We were going to import a whole bunch of cars from Thailand. And what they were going to get was a few Ford Territories from us. The production of the Ford Territories was not sufficient to keep the Ford factories open. We lost the Ford factory, but we got all their cars. We killed off our industry because as those cars came in, there was not sufficient support for local manufacturing. That's how it happens. You see, free trade isn't free. In fact, what it is fair to say, as we always say all of the time, there is no such thing as a free lunch. There is no such thing as a free trade. What there is a whole bunch of compromises that make a trade look free. And usually somebody is hurting, and usually in both countries. Usually in one country, the person is paid far too little, and in the other, the people are losing their jobs. Thank you. It's Milton Keynes.